They say a man's home is his castle, but what if the moment you pick up a paintbrush, your neighbor treats it like a crime scene? I wasn't vandalizing. I wasn't trespassing. I was simply giving my own house a long overdue coat of fresh paint. But for one neighbor, the self-appointed queen of the block, that was apparently enough to call in the law. Within minutes, flashing lights reflected off my half-painted walls, and suddenly, what should have been a quiet Saturday project turned into a spectacle for the entire neighborhood. Strangers slowed their cars, curious eyes peeked from windows, and there I stood, paint roller in hand, facing police officers who clearly weren't sure why they were even called. But the thing about Karen is, she never acts without arrogance. She was so certain she had me cornered, so sure that her power over the neighborhood was unshakable. What she didn't know is that she had just set herself up for the biggest humiliation of her life, because what followed wasn't just a paint job gone wrong. It was the day the entire neighborhood turned against her, and I walked away with a victory she never saw coming. Before that Saturday ever turned into a showdown with flashing lights, the tension had been brewing for years. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns were trimmed to perfection, mailboxes all looked identical, and unspoken expectations hung in the air heavier than the summer heat. While we technically didn't have a strict homeowners association, we had something worse, Karen. She wasn't elected, she wasn't appointed, but she had made herself the guardian of neighborhood standards. Every morning, she would patrol the street, pointing out a trash can left out, too long, a hedge trimmed unevenly, or a car parked slightly off-center. People tolerated her because it was easier than confronting her, and slowly, her word became the neighborhood law. To her, conformity wasn't just a preference, it was a weapon she used to feel powerful. And though I had always kept to myself, painting my house was the one act of independence that shattered her illusion of control. In her mind, I hadn't just changed the color of my siding. I had declared war on her authority, and that was something Karen simply couldn't let slide. For years I had lived quietly in that house, blending in with the endless row of beige, gray, and cream facades that made the neighborhood look more like a copy-and-paste project than a community. But I had reached my limit. Life is too short to live in a place that feels more like a set of rules than a home, and I wanted something that reflected me. After weeks of planning, I finally settled on a bold, rich color that stood out like a statement. Not loud or garish, but different enough that no one could mistake it for another cookie-cutter house. The morning I opened that first can of paint, I felt a surge of freedom I hadn't felt in years. Stroke by stroke, the walls began transforming, turning into something alive, something that carried my identity instead of the neighborhood's imposed uniformity. Neighbors walked by, curious but quiet, offering smiles and nods, but from across the street, I could feel the eyes of one woman burning holes into my back. Karen. She didn't say a word, not yet, but the way she froze on the sidewalk told me everything. To her, this was an unforgivable act of rebellion, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she struck back. It didn't take long for Karen's quiet glare to turn into full-blown interference. At first it was subtle. She paced her driveway a little too often, staring directly at my house, phone in hand as if documenting every brushstroke. By the second day, she made her first move. While I was on a ladder finishing the trim, she marched over, arms crossed, and announced that the color I had chosen was illegal under HOA regulations. I knew she was bluffing because I had double-checked the bylaws myself. Nothing stated the color was restricted, and certainly nothing said a homeowner couldn't paint their own property. Still, Karen thrived on intimidation. She warned me that the HOA president would be hearing about this violation, and with her history of manipulating the board, I knew it wasn't an idle threat. Later that evening, I overheard her gossiping with two other neighbors, loudly complaining that my house was ruining property values. It wasn't about paint, it was about control, and Karen couldn't stand the idea of someone resisting the system she worshipped. The next morning, the situation escalated. While I was hauling supplies out of the garage, I noticed a city inspector walking up my driveway, clipboard in hand. Behind him on the sidewalk stood Karen with a satisfied smirk stretched across her face, phone still in her grip. She had actually filed a complaint, trying to weaponize local authorities to shut me down. That's when I realized this wasn't just a feud over aesthetics. This was war. The inspector's boots crunched against the gravel of my driveway, his eyes already scanning the house as though a crime had been committed. He barely introduced himself before launching into an explanation about a possible code violation, claiming the color I was using hadn't been approved by the neighborhood design committee. I could see Karen in the background, standing just far enough to appear uninvolved, yet close enough that every word seemed to fuel her smug satisfaction. Her arms were folded, her chin slightly raised, her entire presence screaming, "I've won." But she hadn't counted on one thing. I wasn't just a homeowner with a paintbrush. I was a man who had spent years dissecting the law from the bench, a federal judge who knew the difference between legitimate authority and weaponized harassment. I calmly asked the inspector to cite the statute or ordinance backing his claim. He fumbled through his clipboard, flipping through papers that revealed nothing more than a neighbor complaint, no actual violation, no legal basis. When I pressed him harder, demanding the exact section of municipal code, his confidence wavered. Karen's smirk faded as she realized her plan was unraveling right in front of her. The inspector admitted he would need to follow up with his office before taking any action, which in plain terms meant there was no case. I watched him retreat down the driveway, the sound of his boots now much less certain than when he arrived. Karen, however, wasn't done. Her eyes burned with quiet fury, and even as she turned away, I could tell she was already plotting her next move. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about dominance, and Karen wasn't the type to let go without dragging everyone through the mud. If Karen couldn't win through the inspector, she was going to dig deeper, and she did. Within a week, I started receiving letters from the HOA board, each more aggressive than the last, accusing me of everything from unauthorized renovations to community endangerment. The absurdity of the charges was almost laughable, but the intent was clear. She wanted to bury me in paperwork, fines, and intimidation until I cracked. She convened an emergency HOA meeting, my name plastered across the agenda, as if I were some sort of criminal. The whispers in the room told me everything. She had been poisoning the well for weeks, rallying neighbors with stories that I was destroying the community's character with my paint. Sitting quietly, I let her parade her lies, let her ride that wave of control she thrived on, because I knew something she didn't. Every letter, every baseless accusation, every falsified claim she and her board signed off on was being documented, collected, and preserved. Karen wasn't just waging a personal vendetta. She was stepping into the territory of harassment, defamation, and abuse of power, and I was letting her write the script of her own downfall with every stroke of her pen. Karen thought she had the neighborhood eating out of her hand, but control that is built on lies always begins to crack. At first, people went along with her crusade, nodding their heads in meetings, signing petitions they barely read, and whispering about how the new paint didn't fit the vibe. But as weeks passed, her obsession grew too loud to ignore, and neighbors began to notice that every ounce of her energy was directed at me. She showed up at board meetings clutching stacks of fabricated complaints, parading pictures of my house as though it were a crime scene, and demanding immediate action. Yet the house itself told a different story. Clean lines, neat lawn, fresh, paint shimmering under the sun. It wasn't an eyesore, it was a home reborn. Slowly, whispers shifted. People began asking questions, not of me, but of her. Why was she so invested in my walls when the playground down the street had broken swings? Why was she calling emergency meetings over a paint job when the neighborhood gate had been broken for months? Karen, once the queen of HOA authority, began to look less like a leader and more like an obsessed tyrant. I could see it in the way neighbors avoided her eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably in their seats when she spoke, the way polite applause turned to stiff silence. And yet Karen didn't notice the change. She mistook fear for loyalty, mistook quiet compliance for strength. What she couldn't see was that she was pushing too hard, digging too deep, and, in the process, isolating herself from the very people she claimed to protect. And that isolation, slow and steady, was going to be her undoing. All I had to do was keep letting her talk, keep letting her rage, because every word she spoke was another crack in the facade she built, another fracture in her grip of power. The downfall of tyrants is never loud at first. It begins with whispers, the kind that seep into cracks until the whole structure collapses. For Karen, those whispers started with a single neighbor daring to question her authority. In a meeting, asking why she cared more about my house than the HOA's neglected finances. She brushed it off, laughed too loudly, claimed it was all part of her vision for the community. But the seed had been planted, and soon more neighbors began to speak, hesitantly at first, then, with growing boldness, like prisoners realizing the bars were nothing but painted wood. And then came the moment she couldn't control. An inspector arrived, summoned not by me but by residents who had grown tired of her antics, demanding answers about the misuse of HOA funds. The color drained from Karen's face as the inspector combed through receipts, emails, and complaints. Her empire of paper lies suddenly weighed down by the sharp edge of truth. I didn't need to say a word. My silence was more powerful than any defense, because every accusation she hurled only made her look smaller, pettier, more unhinged. Neighbors who once nodded in fear now leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Authority is fragile when it feeds on control, and Karen's had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. The inspector's questions pierced through her excuses like knives through paper, and with every failed answer, every stammer, every nervous shuffle of her papers, the room shifted further away from her. She was no longer the enforcer of rules. She was the defendant, cornered and exposed. And that's when I realized the most brutal truth of all. Karen hadn't just lost the neighborhood. She had lost the illusion that she was untouchable. For the first time, she looked like what she truly was, an ordinary bully, stripped of power, standing alone in a room that once echoed with her commands. When cornered animals lash out, they don't think of survival, they think of dragging someone else down with them, and that was Karen now. The inspector's presence was acid on her ego, burning away the facade she had ruled with for years, and she panicked. So she did what bullies always do. She flipped the script. With trembling hands and a voice dripping with fake authority, she dialed 911, painting me as a dangerous, aggressive homeowner who had violated codes and was threatening her life. She wanted flashing lights, handcuffs, and public humiliation. Her last attempt, to crush me in front of the very neighbors who had begun to see her mask slip. But desperation breeds sloppiness. The inspector stood silently with his clipboard, listening, his brow furrowing, deeper with every word, while neighbors whispered and shook their heads. It became painfully obvious this wasn't a woman in fear, but a tyrant unraveling. And when the police arrived, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Karen's frantic story collapsed instantly against the inspector's calm evidence, documents, statements, and a trail of harassment that painted her as the aggressor, not me. The officer's eyes shifted, not toward me, but toward her, and for the first time Karen's bluster looked less like authority and more like perjury. She tried doubling down, her voice cracking, hands shaking, but each word only tightened the noose she had hung around her own neck. What she thought would be her victory lap had become her public unmasking. And in that moment, Karen finally realized the brutal truth. By calling the police, she hadn't summoned her salvation. She had invited the one force she could never manipulate or control. The law itself had entered the room, and it wasn't on her side. The police presence had shifted the entire energy of the street, and suddenly, neighbors who once watched from behind curtains were stepping out, emboldened by the spectacle of Karen finally losing control. For years, she had ruled through intimidation. Late-night letters shoved under doors, threats of fines, whispered rumors. But all of that authority crumbled the moment the truth came into the open. The inspector's steady voice laid out every piece of evidence: fraudulent HOA auctions, falsified warnings, harassment patterns that painted Karen not as a protector of community values, but as a manipulative tyrant. And the neighbors, one by one, began to murmur their own stories. Mrs. Henderson, who had been fined for her rose garden, the Parkers, who nearly lost their shed, even the quiet couple at the end of the street, who admitted they had been billed for membership dues that didn't exist. Their voices rose like a tide, each testimony striking harder than the last, until Karen stood in the center, her authority stripped bare, her excuses drowned out by the very people she had once silenced. The officers listened closely, scribbling notes, their eyes narrowing with each confession. Karen tried to shout over them, tried to reclaim the narrative, but every word sounded weaker, more desperate, more hollow. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was just another liar caught in the light. And in that moment, she realized the nightmare she had tried to create for me was spiraling back toward her, multiplied tenfold by the fury of neighbors who finally had their chance to speak. For the first time in years, the crowd wasn't afraid. They were united. And Karen, who thrived on fear, found herself utterly powerless in front of the very people she had built her little empire upon. Karen's empire didn't explode, it crumbled. The woman who once barked orders and strutted with false authority now stood trembling, voice cracking as she tried to claw back control. She shouted at neighbors, accused them of betrayal, and demanded respect for all the work she had done, but every word only exposed her desperation. The police didn't flinch, their silence heavier than any accusation. She waved papers she called evidence, but they were nothing. Phony fines, unofficial letters. Fabrications the inspector calmly shredded apart with a few pointed questions. The neighbors who once cowered now whispered and shook their heads, watching their so-called leader unravel in real time. Karen's tone shifted from anger to pleading, insisting she was misunderstood, that she only wanted what was best. But nobody believed her anymore, not after years of harassment, lies, and intimidation. For the first time, she wasn't feared. She was pitied. The officers moved closer, slow and deliberate, while Karen's eyes darted wildly, searching for an ally that no longer existed. The silence of the crowd told her everything. She was finished. No dramatic takedown, no loud collapse, just a slow, humiliating unraveling of a woman who had mistaken fear for power. When her final words fell flat, even she seemed to hear it. The authority she thought was hers had never belonged to her. It had always belonged to the people, and they had just taken it back. When the officers finally moved, it wasn't to arrest me, but to turn toward Karen, the very outcome she had feared most. Calmly, the inspector handed them a folder thick with documents, fake, citations, fabricated violation letters, emails dripping with threats. It wasn't hearsay, it was proof, signed and dated in her own handwriting. Karen's face drained of color as the officers flipped through the pages, their expressions shifting from neutral to grim. The neighbors leaned in, some covering their mouths, others nodding as if finally vindicated. Years of torment were being laid bare in black and white, and for once, there was no way for Karen to twist it. When they read aloud a notice of auction she had sent for my property, completely illegal, the crowd gasped, and Karen stumbled back, whispering excuses that even she didn't believe. The inspector spoke clearly, his voice slicing through the tension. This was fraud, harassment, abuse of authority. The officers didn't need to debate. They stepped forward, placed Karen in cuffs, and for the first time, the queen of the HOA was reduced to a criminal, standing exposed in front of the very people she had ruled with fear. The silence broke into scattered applause, not loud or mocking, but filled with relief, like a community finally freed from a tyrant's grip. As she was led away, she shouted half-baked defenses, threats of lawyers and appeals, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of her neighbors exhaling, like they were finally breathing clean air after years of suffocation. That moment wasn't just about me or my house, it was about justice. Karen had tried to weaponize the system, but in the end, the system swallowed her whole. When Karen's car disappeared down the street with flashing lights trailing, behind, the neighborhood didn't erupt in cheers, it exhaled. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, the kind of silence that carries peace instead of fear. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now walked over, shaking my hand, some apologizing for staying quiet so long, others simply grateful that the nightmare was over. The inspector stayed behind, going over final notes, ensuring that the HOA's books, once Karen's private weapon, would be seized and audited. Fraud on that scale didn't just vanish into the night, it meant lawsuits, restitution, and the possible dismantling of the HOA itself. But what struck me most wasn't the paperwork or the pending charges. It was the look in my neighbors' eyes. They weren't looking at me like the man who painted his house. They were looking at me like the man who stood up when no one else dared. Fear had kept them chained, But Karen's downfall had snapped those links in an instant. Over the weeks that followed, small changes rippled through the community. Families decorated their homes without waiting for permission slips. Kids played in driveways without whispers of fines. Barbecues that had vanished under Karen's reign sprang back, smoke rising like banners of freedom. As for me, I didn't seek credit, and I didn't need it. The real victory wasn't mine alone. It was a neighborhood learning to breathe without a tyrant's hand at its throat. Karen had believed power made her untouchable, but her downfall proved a truth far greater than any. HOA bylaw that when people stop bowing to fear, even the loudest bully is nothing more than noise. Courtrooms have a way of stripping people bare. There are no HOA titles, no president badges, no fake authority to hide behind, just a defendant and the weight of truth. When Karen stood before the judge, the arrogance that once dripped from her every word was gone, replaced by a hollow defiance. That cracked the moment the charges were read aloud: fraud, harassment, misuse of HOA funds, filing false police reports. The neighbors she had bullied for years sat quietly in the gallery, not to gloat, but to witness justice, their presence a living reminder of every scar she left behind. The prosecution laid out a case so airtight it could suffocate, each document, each testimony, another nail sealing the coffin of her empire. I didn't need to speak. My evidence, my persistence, had already spoken louder than I ever could. Karen tried, of course, to reclaim the stage, crocodile tears, excuses about misunderstandings, desperate claims that she had only ever protected the community. But the courtroom wasn't her cul-de-sac, and the judge wasn't a neighbor she could intimidate. Every word she uttered only deepened the pit beneath her feet. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the silence was deafening, broken only by the final gavel that echoed like thunder rolling over the ruins of her reign. Karen wasn't let out as a leader. She wasn't even seen as a neighbor anymore. She was escorted out as a criminal, head bowed, wrists bound, her empire reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. And as I watched her disappear through the doors, I realized something profound. Karen hadn't just lost her freedom, she had lost the one thing she craved above all: control. In that moment, justice wasn't just served, it was engraved into the history of our neighborhood. A reminder that no tyrant, no matter how loud or ruthless, can outlast the truth. When the dust finally settled, the neighborhood was unrecognizable, not in its houses or lawns, but in its spirit. Where fear had once lived, there was now relief, laughter echoing across yards that had been silent under Karen's watch. Neighbors who once kept blinds drawn now shared meals, stories, and a newfound sense of unity born from surviving her reign. The HOA, once a weapon in her hands, was rebuilt from the ground up. Transparent, fair, a system meant to serve, not to oppress. And me? I didn't walk away with vengeance in my heart, I walked away with clarity. Justice isn't about crushing an enemy, it's about restoring balance, reminding the powerful that their reach ends where the law begins. Karen thought her rules were ironclad, that her threats were unshakable, but, in the end, they were nothing more than paper walls torn down by truth. Standing on my porch one evening, the sunset washing the street in gold, I realized the greatest victory wasn't her downfall. It was the freedom we all reclaimed, the proof that no bully, no tyrant can rule forever. Her name became a whisper, a cautionary tale passed between neighbors when new issues arose, always ending the same way. Remember what happened to Karen? And that was enough. Because in the quiet peace of that community, in the laughter of children playing on sidewalks she once tried to police, I saw the legacy of her defeat. Not just my victory, not just the court's judgment, but a collective reminder that standing up, even against the loudest voice, even against the cruelest force, is never in vain. Karen's empire had collapsed, but in its ruins, we built something stronger, a community that would never bow to fear again. And as for me, Christopher, I knew this chapter of my life had closed, but its lesson would never leave me. So that was Karen's downfall, a story that began with petty rules and ended with the law stripping her of the power she worshipped. But remember, stories like these aren't just about one HOA, one Karen, or one courtroom victory. They're reminders of how fragile power is when built on fear, and how unstoppable truth becomes when people finally stand together. And if you found yourself hooked by every twist, every moment of suspense, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Here at HOA Rule Rage, we uncover the battles behind closed doors, the drama, the corruption, the revenge, and the justice that follows. So don't just watch, be part of the journey. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, and share this story with someone. Who knows what it's like to face a Karen in their own life? And tell me in the comments, if you were in my shoes, how would you have handled it? Your voice keeps this community alive. Until next time, stay sharp, stay strong, and never let fear write your story.